A dog finds baby in trash and takes him to hospital. Doctor horrified. The bustling city streets were alive with activity as usual, horns blaring, people hurrying past one another, and the occasional street vendor calling out to sell their wares. Amid the chaos, no one paid much attention to the scruffy dog that wandered the alleys. His matted fur and thin frame told a story of survival, and though life had been unkind to him, there was an undeniable intelligence in his dark eyes. For the stray dog, every day was the same, a desperate search for food, a safe place to rest, and maybe, just maybe, a kind human to show him a little compassion. But today was different. Today his sharp ears caught a sound that made him stop in his tracks. It was faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the city, a soft, weak cry. The dog tilted his head, listening intently as the sound grew clearer. His instincts told him this was no ordinary noise. He followed it, weaving through the maze of trash-strewn alleys, his nose sniffing the air as he drew closer. Finally, he reached a heap of garbage bags piled behind an old dumpster. There, buried beneath the refuse, was the source of the sound, a baby. The infant was wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket, its tiny fists trembling as it let out another feeble wail. The dog stepped closer, his nose twitching as he sniffed the bundle. There was no doubt in his mind, this tiny human needed help, and he was the only one who could provide it. Without hesitation, the dog gently grabbed the edge of the blanket in his teeth and began to tug. The baby let out a startled cry but didn't resist as the dog carefully pulled him free from the trash. The sight of the frail infant stirred something deep within the dog, a fierce protectiveness, a determination to save this helpless life. But where could he take the baby? The dog's keen mind worked quickly, his thoughts darting through the options. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, he began to move. His paws padded swiftly down the alley, the bundle secure in his grip as he headed toward the only place he could think of, the nearby hospital. The journey wasn't easy. The dog navigated through busy streets, dodging cars and ignoring the shouts of passers-by who stared in confusion at the sight of a stray carrying a baby. Some tried to approach, but the dog growled softly, his body tense with urgency. He couldn't stop, he had to keep moving. Finally, the hospital came into view, its bright lights shining like a beacon in the darkening evening. The dog quickened his pace, his heart pounding as he approached the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he would be allowed inside, but then he pushed forward, his determination stronger than his fear. Inside, the hospital was a flurry of activity. Nurses and doctors moved briskly through the halls, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of medical jargon. No one noticed the dog at first, not until he barked, a loud, commanding sound that echoed through the room and brought everyone to a halt. All eyes turned to the scruffy dog standing at the entrance, the bundle in his mouth trembling slightly. Gasps filled the room as one of the nurses stepped forward, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "Is that a baby?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog barked again, his eyes pleading as he carefully placed the bundle on the floor. The nurse rushed forward, her hands trembling as she unwrapped the blanket. What she saw made her gasp. The nurse's hands trembled as she unwrapped the dirty blanket. Inside was a tiny baby, no older than a few days, its skin pale and its body frail. The infant let out a weak, pitiful cry, barely audible over the collective gasp of the emergency room staff. "Get a doctor now," the nurse shouted, her voice breaking as she lifted the baby into her arms. The hospital erupted into action, nurses and doctors rushing forward as the stray dog stood frozen by the door, watching every move with intense, unblinking eyes. The head pediatrician, Dr. Elena Garcia, arrived moments later, her face etched with a mix of professionalism and shock. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp as she quickly assessed the situation. "One of the patients said this dog walked in, carrying the baby," a nurse stammered, her gaze flickering between the child and the scruffy stray. "We don't know anything else yet." Dr. Garcia's focus was entirely on the baby. "This child is severely dehydrated and hypothermic," she said, her voice tight as she gently examined the infant. "We need a warming blanket, for fluids and oxygen. Immediately." The team sprang into action, whisking the baby away to the neonatal intensive care unit. Dr. Garcia hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the dog still standing by the door. Its eyes followed the baby as it disappeared into the hallway, a low whine escaping its throat. "Where did you come from?" Dr. Garcia whispered, more to herself than the dog. She crouched down slowly, extending a hand. "You saved that baby, didn't you?" The dog didn't move at first, its body tense with uncertainty. But then, as if sensing her intentions, it stepped forward and pressed its nose against her hand. Dr. Garcia felt a lump rise in her throat. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This dog understood the gravity of what it had done. As the medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize the baby, the dog refused to leave the hospital. It sat near the entrance, its eyes fixed on the hallway where the infant had been taken. Nurses brought it water and scraps of food, but it barely touched them, its focus unwavering. By morning, news of the extraordinary rescue had spread throughout the hospital. Doctors, patients, and staff whispered in awe about the stray dog who had brought a baby to safety. Local news outlets caught wind of the story, and reporters began to gather outside, eager to capture the tale of the heroic dog. Meanwhile, in the neonatal intensive care unit, Dr. Garcia and her team worked around the clock to save the baby. The infant's condition was critical, severely malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of exposure. But the staff refused to give up. "We don't know how long the baby was out there," Dr. Garcia said, her voice heavy with emotion as she addressed her team. "But thanks to that dog, we have a chance to save this child." Hours later, the baby's condition stabilized. It was still weak, but its breathing was steady, and a faint flush of color had returned to its cheeks. Dr. Garcia leaned against the wall of the NICU, exhaustion written across her face. She couldn't stop thinking about the dog, the look in its eyes, the way it had stayed by the baby's side. Outside, the dog remained vigilant, its body curled near the hospital doors as if keeping watch. When Dr. Garcia finally stepped outside, the dog's ears perked up, and it stood, wagging its tail cautiously. "The baby's going to be okay," she said softly, crouching to meet the dog's gaze. "You did something incredible. You saved a life." The dog wagged its tail harder, pressing its nose into her palm as if to say thank you. Dr. Garcia felt tears prick her eyes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small biscuit, offering it to the dog. "You're a hero," she whispered. The story didn't end there. As the hospital began investigating the baby's origins, shocking details began to emerge about how the child had ended up in such a dire situation. Meanwhile, the dog's heroic actions captured the hearts of people everywhere, sparking an outpouring of love and support. As the baby stabilized, the hospital began working with authorities to uncover how the child had ended up abandoned in the trash. Detectives arrived, speaking with Dr. Garcia and the nurses who had witnessed the dog's arrival. The situation was heartbreaking, but it also raised many questions. "Does the baby have any identification?" one detective asked, jotting notes in a small notebook. Dr. Garcia shook her head. "Nothing. No tag, no blanket with a name, just the baby wrapped in that dirty cloth." The detective glanced toward the NICU, where the baby was now resting under careful observation. "And the dog? Have you ever seen it before?" "No," Dr. Garcia replied. "But it's still here. It hasn't left since it brought the baby." The dog had become a fixture outside the hospital, refusing to leave the entrance despite the bustling crowd of reporters, patients, and staff. News of its heroic act had gone viral, and donations poured in from animal lovers and advocates across the country. People brought food, blankets, and toys for the dog, but it showed little interest in anything other than keeping watch. Inside, the baby's story began to unfold. Forensic analysis of the blanket and items found with the child provided clues that led detectives to a nearby neighborhood. They canvassed the area, asking questions and following leads until they uncovered a shocking truth. The baby had been abandoned by a frightened teenager, overwhelmed and unable to care for the child. The young mother, now located by authorities, broke down in tears as she confessed. "I didn't know what else to do," she sobbed. "I thought no one would ever find him." The detectives were sympathetic but firm. "You're lucky that dog did what it did," one officer said gently. "Your baby's alive because of him." The case took a compassionate turn as social services stepped in, working with the young mother to ensure she received the support she needed. The baby, however, remained in the hospital's care while decisions about its future were made. Meanwhile, the dog, now affectionately called Hero by the hospital staff, became a beloved figure. Nurses brought it treats, and children from the pediatric wing begged to meet the brave dog who saved the baby. Dr. Garcia, in particular, felt a deep connection to Hero, whose loyalty and courage reminded her of the qualities she valued most in her work. One evening, as Dr. Garcia sat beside the dog outside the hospital, she spoke softly. "You knew what to do when no one else could. You didn't just save a life, you gave that baby a chance at something better. How did you know?" Hero wagged his tail slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet understanding that seemed almost human. The hospital decided to honor Hero's actions in a special ceremony, inviting the community to celebrate the dog's incredible rescue. On the day of the event, the baby, now healthier and stronger, was brought out for the first time, bundled in a warm blanket. The crowd gasped as Hero stepped forward, his tail wagging excitedly as he sniffed the baby gently. The moment was electric, filled with cheers and applause. Reporters captured the reunion, and Hero's story inspired people around the world. Donations to local animal shelters skyrocketed, and Hero became a symbol of hope, loyalty, and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. But for Dr. Garcia, the connection went deeper. She had grown attached to Hero during his time at the hospital, and she couldn't bear the thought of him returning to life as a stray. After the ceremony, she knelt beside him, her voice filled with emotion. "How would you feel about coming home with me?" Hero wagged his tail furiously, his answer clear. From that day on, Hero became part of Dr. Garcia's family, his days filled with love and warmth. The weeks following the ceremony brought closure and new beginnings for everyone involved. The young mother, overwhelmed but genuinely remorseful, began working with social services to rebuild her life. With the help of counselors and community support, she found stability, determined to create a future where she could someday reunite with her child. For now, however, the baby remained in the care of the hospital, waiting for a family to step forward. The story of Hero, the brave stray who had saved the child, had captured the hearts of many. Offers of adoption poured in from all corners of the country, each one touched by the baby's miraculous rescue. Dr. Garcia played a pivotal role in finding the perfect home. She personally reviewed every application, determined to ensure the baby would be raised in an environment filled with love, stability, and kindness. The day finally came when a family was chosen, a warm, compassionate couple who had long dreamed of having a child. On the morning of the handoff, the hospital staff gathered to say goodbye. The baby, now thriving and full of life, cooed softly in the arms of its new mother as the couple thanked the team for their tireless care. Hero, sitting proudly beside Dr. Garcia, watched the moment intently. When the baby reached out a tiny hand, Hero leaned forward and gently nuzzled it, his eyes bright with affection. The crowd, already emotional, erupted into applause. "It feels like a proper farewell," Dr. Garcia said softly, stroking Hero's fur. "He brought this baby into the world twice, once from the trash and once into the arms of a family." As the baby's new family left the hospital, Hero turned his gaze toward Dr. Garcia, wagging his tail as if to say, "Our job here is done." From that day forward, Hero settled into his new life with Dr. Garcia. The once scruffy stray now had a home, complete with a cozy bed, endless treats, and the admiration of everyone who knew his story. Dr. Garcia often took Hero on walks through the neighborhood, where children would run up to pet him and adults would stop to thank her for giving him a second chance. Hero wore a special collar engraved with the words, "Hero, always saving lives." Hero's fame didn't fade with time. His story became a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring countless people to take action in their own communities. Animal shelters saw an increase in adoptions, and programs were established to train rescue dogs for emergencies. Hero himself was honored at several events, where he would sit calmly beside Dr. Garcia, his tail wagging as he soaked in the admiration. For Dr. Garcia, Hero was more than just a companion. He was a reminder of why she had chosen her profession. His courage and selflessness mirrored the qualities she aspired to in her own work, and together they made a formidable team. Years later, as Dr. Garcia and Hero sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that fateful day. "You've done so much, Hero," she said, scratching behind his ears. "More than anyone could ever ask for." Hero let out a soft huff, his eyes closing as he rested his head on her lap. Dr. Garcia smiled, her heart full as she gazed at the horizon. Somewhere, in the laughter of children and the kindness of strangers, she could feel the ripple effect of Hero's act of love. And though Hero's story had begun as a stray wandering the alleys, it had ended with a legacy of hope, loyalty, and the enduring bond between a dog and the lives he had saved. As the years went by, Hero's story became the cornerstone of a movement that transcended the small act of saving a single life. Inspired by his bravery, Dr. Garcia spearheaded a nationwide initiative to connect rescue animals with hospitals, nursing homes, and schools. The program, aptly named Hero's Hearts, aimed to highlight the incredible instincts and compassion that animals could bring to human lives. Hero himself became the face of the movement. Photographs of him sitting proudly with his engraved collar, alongside Dr. Garcia, adorned brochures and websites. Hospitals across the country implemented programs that welcomed therapy animals, creating spaces where patients could find comfort and hope. One particularly moving moment came when Dr. Garcia received a letter from the baby's adoptive parents. Attached was a photo of the now toddler, smiling brightly as he held a small stuffed dog with a collar that read Hero. The letter described the boy's boundless energy, his love for animals, and how he would point at every dog he saw and say, "Like my hero." Dr. Garcia felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the letter. Hero, lying at her feet, perked up at the sound of her sniffles. She reached down to scratch his ears, her voice thick with emotion. "You did that," she whispered. "You gave him the chance to grow up happy." As Hero grew older, his once boundless energy began to wane. His muzzle turned gray and his steps became slower, but his spirit remained as steadfast as ever. Dr. Garcia adjusted her routine to accommodate his needs, ensuring his golden years were filled with love, comfort, and quiet moments by her side. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Hero rested his head on her lap, his breathing slow and steady. The stars overhead twinkled brightly, and a warm breeze rustled the leaves. Dr. Garcia felt a deep sense of peace, her hand gently stroking Hero's fur. "You've done so much, Hero," she said softly. "Not just for me but for so many others. You've left a mark on this world that will never fade." When Hero passed peacefully in his sleep a few months later, the loss was felt deeply by everyone whose lives he had touched. The hospital held a memorial service in his honor, and hundreds of people attended, bringing flowers, letters, and photos of their own pets who had been inspired by Hero's story. At the service, Dr. Garcia spoke through tears, holding Hero's engraved collar in her hands. "Hero showed us that love doesn't need words. It's in the actions, the quiet bravery, and the unwavering loyalty that he demonstrated every day. He didn't just save a baby, he saved us all by reminding us of the good in the world." In the years that followed, Hero's hearts continued to grow, reaching more communities and saving countless lives. Hero's statue, erected outside the hospital where his story began, became a place where people would leave flowers, dog toys, and handwritten notes thanking him for his impact. For Dr. Garcia, Hero's memory lived on in her work and in her heart. Every time she walked through the hospital doors or saw a dog helping a patient, she thought of him. And though he was no longer by her side, she felt his presence in the quiet moments, guiding her with the same steadfast love that had brought a baby to safety so many years ago. Hero's legacy wasn't just a story, it was a movement, a testament to the power of love and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. And in every act of kindness inspired by his memory, his spirit continued to shine. Hero's passing marked the end of a chapter, but his influence only grew stronger in the years that followed. The statue outside the hospital became a symbol of hope, attracting visitors from across the country. Families would bring their children to hear the story of the dog who saved a baby, and aspiring veterinarians and rescue workers would leave handwritten notes, inspired by Hero's unwavering courage. Dr. Garcia continued her work with Hero's Hearts, devoting herself to expanding the program globally. She traveled to schools, shelters, and medical centers, sharing Hero's story and encouraging others to see animals not just as companions but as partners in healing and resilience. One day, during a speaking event in a bustling city, a young boy approached her after the presentation. He held a worn copy of a children's book titled Hero's Journey, one of the many inspired by Hero's life. The boy, no older than 10, looked up at Dr. Garcia with wide eyes. "Dr. Garcia," he said shyly, clutching the book to his chest, "I want to be like you and Hero. I want to help animals and people." Dr. Garcia knelt to his level, her heart swelling with pride. "You already are," she said with a warm smile. "By sharing his story, you're keeping Hero's legacy alive." Back in her hometown, the hospital continued to honor Hero in its daily operations. Every new staff member was told his story, and his statue became a place of reflection for patients and workers alike. On the anniversary of his heroic act, the hospital hosted a community day, inviting local shelters to bring adoptable animals and organizing events that celebrated the bond between humans and pets. One of the most poignant moments came years later, when the baby Hero had rescued, now a teenager, returned to the hospital. The young man, tall and confident, walked up to the statue of Hero with a bouquet of flowers. Placing them gently at its base, he whispered, "Thank you," his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Dr. Garcia, watching from nearby, approached him. "He'd be so proud to see you now," she said softly. The boy turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "He saved my life," he said. "And because of him, I've grown up knowing how much kindness matters. I want to do something meaningful like he did." Tears filled Dr. Garcia's eyes as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already are," she said. As time passed, Heroes Hearts became a global initiative, its reach extending to remote communities and underserved areas. The program's impact was immeasurable, connecting rescue animals with people in need and transforming lives in ways no one could have imagined. And though Hero's story was retold countless times, its essence remained the same: an act of selflessness by a stray dog who saw a baby in need and refused to give up. In her later years, Dr. Garcia retired from her position at the hospital but remained a dedicated advocate for animals. On quiet evenings, she would sit by Hero's statue, reflecting on the journey they had shared. Sometimes she would see a dog passing by or hear a child laughing, and it would remind her of Hero's spirit, a presence that still lingered, quietly shaping the world. One such evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Dr. Garcia placed a fresh flower at the base of the statue. "Thank you, Hero," she whispered, "for everything you gave us. You'll always be a part of us." And as the stars began to twinkle above, the world seemed a little brighter, as if Hero's spirit was watching, wagging his tail, and reminding everyone that love and courage could change the world. Years after Dr. Garcia retired, her work with Heroes Hearts evolved into something she had never imagined. The program wasn't just about rescue animals anymore. It had grown into a worldwide movement of kindness, bridging the gap between humans and animals in ways that transformed communities. Hospitals around the world now had dedicated wings named after Hero, their walls adorned with murals of his iconic story. Each mural told the tale of the scruffy stray dog who had braved the odds to save a helpless baby. In these spaces, children undergoing treatment found comfort in therapy animals, many of them rescues themselves, and families discovered a renewed sense of hope. One day, Dr. Garcia was invited to a special event at a new hospital in a remote village. When she arrived, she was astonished to see a statue of Hero standing proudly at the entrance, its base inscribed with the words, "In honor of Hero whose love and courage taught us to care for one another." The event brought together people from all walks of life: doctors, veterinarians, shelter workers, and volunteers, united by Hero's legacy. As Dr. Garcia spoke to the crowd, her voice steady and filled with emotion, she reflected on how far the journey had come. "Hero's story isn't just about a single act of bravery," she said. "It's about the way love and kindness ripple outward, touching lives in ways we can't always see. Hero showed us that every life matters, no matter how small or overlooked. And today, his spirit continues to guide us." The crowd erupted into applause, but for Dr. Garcia, the true reward was seeing the children running up to pet the therapy dogs, their laughter echoing through the air. It was a reminder of why she had devoted her life to this cause and how Hero's actions had sparked a movement far beyond what she had imagined. Back home, Dr. Garcia often found herself visiting Hero's statue at the hospital where it all began. One particularly quiet evening, she noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench nearby, a small dog resting at his feet. The man looked up as she approached, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "You're the one who started all this," he said, gesturing toward the statue. "Hero's story, it gave me hope when I needed it most." Dr. Garcia sat beside him, her heart warmed by his words. "He gave me hope too," she said softly. "And he's still giving it even now." They sat in companionable silence, watching as a young family walked past with a dog in tow. The child paused to touch the statue, his small fingers brushing against the engraved words. Dr. Garcia smiled, knowing that Hero's story would continue to inspire generations to come. As the years passed, Hero's legacy became woven into the fabric of countless lives. Schools taught his story as a lesson in compassion. Communities rallied together to support animal shelters and rescue efforts. And individuals, inspired by the scruffy dog's courage, found the strength to create their own acts of kindness. Dr. Garcia, now older but still filled with purpose, often reflected on how a single moment, a stray dog finding a baby in need, had sparked a movement that spanned the globe. Hero's story wasn't just a memory, it was a living force, carried forward by every life it touched. On a quiet, star-filled night, as Dr. Garcia sat on her porch looking out at the world Hero had changed, she felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that his spirit was still out there, wagging its tail in the hearts of everyone who believed in the power of love and resilience. And somewhere, in the echoes of time, Hero's story continued to ripple outward, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave a legacy that lasted forever. It had been years since Hero's story had first touched the world, but its ripple effects were still unfolding. Dr. Garcia, now in her later years, had seen the hero's heart's initiative flourish beyond her wildest dreams. She had traveled the globe, met countless people inspired by Hero, and witnessed firsthand the good that had come from a single act of bravery. But one evening, a phone call shattered the peace of her quiet retirement. On the other end was a former colleague from the hospital. His voice was tense. "Elena, there's something you need to see," he said urgently. "It's about the baby Hero saved." Dr. Garcia's breath caught. Though she had followed the baby's journey for years, now a teenager adopted into a loving family, she hadn't been in close contact recently. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. "There's been an accident," the colleague replied grimly. "He's in critical condition." Dr. Garcia was on the next flight to the hospital where it all began. Memories of Hero flooded her mind as she stared out the airplane window, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her. That baby, now a young man named Caleb, had always felt like a part of Hero's legacy. She had watched him grow from a fragile infant into a bright, compassionate teen, and now his life hung in the balance. When she arrived, the hospital was a flurry of activity. Caleb had been involved in a severe car accident, and his injuries were extensive. The doctors were doing everything they could, but the prognosis was uncertain. As Dr. Garcia stepped into the ICU, her heart sank at the sight of Caleb's pale, still form surrounded by machines. His adoptive parents stood nearby, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. They turned to her, relief flickering in their eyes. "You came?" his mother said softly, tears streaming down her face. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," Dr. Garcia replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "He's a fighter. He always has been." In the days that followed, Caleb's condition remained critical. Dr. Garcia spent every waking moment at the hospital, sitting vigil by his bedside and offering comfort to his parents. She couldn't help but feel the echoes of Hero's spirit in the room. The same resilience, the same unyielding hope that had defined the dog who had saved Caleb's life all those years ago. One evening, as she sat alone in the waiting room, she felt a strange sensation. A warmth, a quiet presence that seemed to fill the space around her. It was as if Hero himself were there, his steady gaze and wagging tail offering reassurance. "You didn't give up on him then," Dr. Garcia whispered to the empty room. "And I won't give up on him now." Miraculously, Caleb began to show signs of improvement. His breathing steadied, his color returned, and eventually he opened his eyes. The doctors called it a breakthrough, but to Dr. Garcia and Caleb's parents, it felt like a miracle. When Caleb was strong enough to speak, his first words were to Dr. Garcia. "I dreamed of him," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Hero. He was here." Tears filled her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "He's always been here," she said. "Watching over you just like he always has." Caleb's recovery was slow but steady, and his family and Dr. Garcia remained by his side every step of the way. As he regained his strength, Caleb spoke often of the connection he felt to Hero, a bond that had guided him through his darkest moments. Months later, Caleb stood before a crowd at a special event honoring Hero's legacy. Though still recovering, his voice was strong as he addressed the audience. "I owe my life to Hero, not once but twice," he said. "He saved me as a baby, and even now his story gives me the strength to keep going. Hero taught me that love and courage can overcome anything, and I want to carry that lesson forward." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the space. Dr. Garcia watched from the front row, her heart full as Caleb's words resonated with the crowd. In the quiet moments after the event, Caleb and Dr. Garcia stood before Hero's statue together. The boy who had once been abandoned now stood tall, a living testament to the power of love, loyalty, and resilience. "Do you think he knows?" Caleb asked, his eyes fixed on the statue. Dr. Garcia smiled, her hand resting on Caleb's shoulder. "I know he does," she said softly. "And he's so proud of you." As they stood in the fading light, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves around them, carrying with it a quiet warmth. It was as if Hero's spirit was there, wagging his tail and reminding them both that his legacy was far from over. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and amber, Caleb and Dr. Garcia lingered by Hero's statue. The hospital courtyard was quiet now, the echoes of the earlier event fading into a peaceful stillness. Caleb reached out, running his fingers over the engraved words at the base of the statue. "In honor of Hero, whose love and courage taught us to care for one another." "He was more than a dog," Caleb said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion brimming within it. "He was a protector, a guide. And he's still guiding us, isn't he?" Dr. Garcia nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Yes," she said, her voice full of conviction. "Hero's legacy isn't just in what he did, it's in the lives he touched, the love he inspired, and the hope he gave to everyone who heard his story. That legacy lives on in you, Caleb." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of Hero's impact settling over them like a comforting blanket. Caleb straightened, his resolve clear in his eyes. "I want to carry on his work," he said firmly. "I want to be part of Hero's hearts, to help others the way he helped me." Dr. Garcia smiled, pride and affection shining in her expression. "You already are," she said. "Every step you take, every life you touch, that's Hero's work continuing through you." As the years passed, Caleb became a key figure in the Hero's Hearts movement, dedicating his life to connecting rescue animals with those in need. Inspired by Hero's story, he worked tirelessly to expand the program, reaching communities around the globe and creating opportunities for countless animals and humans to heal together. Dr. Garcia, in her quiet retirement, watched with pride as Caleb carried forward the torch. On her peaceful evenings, she would visit Hero's statue, placing flowers or simply sitting nearby to reflect. She felt his presence in those moments, a warmth, a quiet reassurance that the work they had started was in good hands. One day, long after Dr. Garcia's passing, Caleb returned to the hospital where it all began. Now a man who had dedicated his life to Hero's vision, he stood before the statue with his own young daughter at his side. She looked up at him with wide eyes, clutching a small stuffed dog that bore a striking resemblance to Hero. "Tell me the story again, Daddy," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Caleb knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on the statue. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a brave dog named Hero, who showed us all what it means to love without limits and to care without fear.